Hi, David.
Hi, Bob. Good to hear from you.
Good to see you. How are you doing?
You know my dark views on Darwinian life, but at least by Darwinian standards, you could say I'm flourishing.
Actually, I wasn't aware of quite how dark your Darwinian views are, but maybe we can explore those. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are David Pearce, one of the co-founders of the World Transhumanist Association, which is, one of the major transhumanist associations. Now it's known as Humanity Plus, but you're certainly a big figure in the transhumanist movement. You have a slightly different emphasis than I associate with a lot of transhumanists. There's a particular part of the transhumanist declaration that you put particular emphasis on. It's number 7, transhumanism advocates the well-being of all sentience and encompasses many principles of modern humanism. You have gone so far as to say that you're devoted to the elimination of all suffering in all sentient beings, which actually sounds a little Buddhist. We can get into the differences between your perspective and the Buddhist perspective, but not totally unrelated to this. One distinctive thing about you is that, as I understand it, you have never ever in your entire life tasted meat. So you are on board with the kind of I guess you could call them the animal rights people. That said, a lot of your work is about how our species, human beings, can attain, or you hope can attain bliss, what you call information-sensitive gradients of bliss. We'll get clearer on what that means. But anyway, welcome. Have I said anything so far that's untrue?
No, the fact that I've never tasted meat is an accident of birth rather than a badge of superior virtue on my part. Yes, I'm a third-generation vegetarian stroke vegan. But consider what was it precisely? Buddha said, "May all that hath life be delivered from suffering."
Mm-hmm.
What is distinctive is not this particular value or ethical system of phasing out suffering in humans and non-humans. What is distinctive is the actual technology to turn fine words into practice. Yes, in terms of transhumanism, the particular strand that I represent or most interests me is only one part of a much broader movement. I mean, sometimes simplistically, one can speak of the 3 supers: super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness.
Is that a good kind of thumbnail definition of transhumanism? Those 3 aspirations?
Yes, I mean. It's simplistic, but nonetheless, if you want a little mnemonic, that is a useful summary. One could go into the complexities of each of these 3 supers, and some people would add a 4th super. But yes, that I think is a good way to summarize it.
So the
fairness,
transhumanists want to use all available technology to make us live as long as possible, ideally forever, be as smart as possible, and be as happy as possible.
Yes, beautifully put. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Who could object to that? Now, one quick little, one more business piece of transhumanist branding business. Why did you do the rebranding? Why is the World Transhumanist Association now known as Humanity Plus? Has the term transhumanist become problematic for marketing purposes, or what?
Yes, I mean, personally, I'm very happy to call myself a transhumanist. Indeed, I would aspire to be not just transhuman, but post-human, though that's probably a forlorn hope. But nonetheless, undoubtedly, the term does alarm some people, and some branding specialists feel that Humanity Plus emphasizes that the changes we advocate will be enhancing all that is best in humans, not something radically alien. But but most people know us as transhumanists, and I'm personally quite happy with the label. The transhumanist movement has grown far beyond any particular organization or even group of self-identified transhumanists. It's one of these labels that is too convenient to give up. Just like, something like that, left, right in politics. Everyone can agree it's hopelessly simplistic in one sense, and that you can't do without it. And in terms of transhumanist ideas of radical life extension, of intelligence amplification, genetically rewriting our source code to get rid of any form of involuntary suffering, the transhumanist label, I think it's going to stick.
What are the most unfortunate stereotypes about transhumanists that you encounter? What are the misconceptions that you most urgently try to dispel?
Well, some are innocent, indeed quite comical. Some people confuse transhumanism with transsexualism. Others, on the other hand, are rather more serious. I think some people equate transhumanism with a very selfish caricature of libertarian politics. And it's certainly true there are libertarian transhumanists and people who are transhumanists primarily because they want to live forever. But there's also a much broader strand of transhumanism that is global, indeed universalist in its aspirations. And yes, you quoted Article 7 of the Transhumanist Declaration, our commitment to the well-being of all sentience. It's a useful reminder, I think, that yes, of what our ultimate aspirations are.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one thing that got my attention about you, is you do defy that stereotype. I mean, I must say, without thinking about it, I had been implicitly associating transhumanists with a certain kind of egocentrism. I mean, it just, the idea I got was that each individual transhumanist was bent on themselves living forever or whatever, maybe doing cryogenics to make sure they live forever or whatever, or really devoting themselves to life extension, but being focused on themselves. Your own emphasis is very explicitly not that. I'm sure you are interested in yourself, but you're shaking your head. Are you not interested?
Well, I'm saying no. I was agreeing with you essentially that I'm as self-interested in practice as the next person. I was really not. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But still, you do have this emphasis that in some ways it does sound like Buddhism. Your methodology is very different from the Buddhist methodology. As far as I know, you don't meditate and have another approach to attaining bliss. But there is that interesting distinction, or at least distinction in kind of appearance, a superficial distinction. Maybe my preconceptions about transhumanism were all wrong, and it's unfair to think of. Say, is Ray Kurzweil, is he considered a transhumanist, by the way? But I think of him as somebody who's like totally devoted to like living as long as possible, like taking 300 pills a day or whatever.
Ray Kurzweil is a more archetypal transhumanist, not least because of his exuberant optimism. And I would say most transhumanists, and I'm very much an exception here, are life-loving optimists.
So you're not an optimist. I mean, you are by definition. It's your professional obligation to be an optimist, but by nature, you're not?
Temperamentally, I'm not. I mean, it is true technically because I do think we are likely to phase out the biology of suffering in our forward light cone. This makes one sound rather optimistic.
Yeah.
Indeed, most pessimists don't think we're heading for a future of gradients of superhuman bliss. But I suppose temperamentally, at any rate, I'm more likely to focus on the dark side of life. And it's yeah, in view of the obscene amount of suffering in the world, yes, a lot of the time I find it quite hard to focus on our glorious future.
See, that's Buddhist too. I mean, the Buddha, according to the standard story, was struck by how much suffering there was in the world, and for that reason, devoted himself to overcoming it. So do I take it that you are not, the kind of apotheosis of transhumanist optimism is the singularity? Not that all transhumanists would say they subscribe to the singularity, but it's associated with Kurzweil, and I've heard different definitions of what it is, but it's this idea that we're approaching some kind of glorious moment or other, more or less inexorably, I guess. But are you not like a singularity person?
I think it's rather it's boring, but one really does need to define one's terms here. In terms of the singularity, I sometimes, once again, here's a useful trichotomy. There are some transhumanists who believe in the so-called intelligence explosion. This is the idea that recursively self-improving software-based agents are going to there's going to be some kind of runaway intelligence explosion that may be inimical to human interests. This is associated with I.J. Good, Miri, Elisea Yudkowsky, and most recently Nick Bostrom's book Superintelligence. Then there is another conception of superintelligence, which is associated with Ray Kurzweil, much more, in some ways, optimistic version in which humans are essentially going to merge with our technology, our machines, possibly some form of mind uploading. And there's a third conception of superintelligence, and it's the one I incline to, which thinks that post-human superintelligence will probably also be our biological descendants, that we are going to augment ourselves massively with artificial intelligence. We are going to enhance our own genetic code, but nonetheless, it's not going to be some kind of alien being.
So you don't worry about the Matrix scenario where we unimproved human beings are eventually subjugated by increasingly superior robots.
No, I don't personally buy that scenario. No, I think it's transposing the mentality of the African savannah onto the far future. Yeah.
Okay, well that's good. And one more kind of anthropological question about transhumanists. So do I take it from what you said that not all transhumanists are optimistic? It's not part of the definition. I mean, didn't I understand you to say that there are people who, in imagining a kind of runaway artificial intelligence, think that could work out badly? That you can be a transhumanist and worry that could work out badly, and then presumably try to avert the bad outcome?
Yes, I mean, MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, that has been influential with a lot of transhumanists, not least Nick Bostrom, think a human unfriendly outcome is on balance quite likely. Indeed, perhaps ask oneself, if you do buy into the intelligence explosion scenario, how likely is a post-human superintelligence to exhibit status quo bias? I mean, would one deliberately create creatures like humans, give of all the different ways that one could optimize matter and energy? This might seem quite unlikely.
No, what might seem quite unlikely? That the machines would have reason to keep humans around?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's difficult to speculate what will be the values of post-human superintelligence. But if one buys into the intelligence explosion scenario, then by most criteria, humans as we exist today are extremely suboptimal. I mean, malaise-ridden, dysfunctional, suffering creatures. Why shouldn't we be turned into something radically different?
like batteries in the Matrix scenario, or maybe something else.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so okay, but your own view is that it is through our own lineage that superintelligence will be realized most plausibly, and you would also like to see enduring happiness, even bliss, realized in our lineage, and for that matter, in other biological lineages, and I guess non-biological ones if they're sentient. Is there a connection? What kind of connection is there between those two aspirations? In other words, greater intelligence and more happiness. Now, in Buddhism, there's a kind of connection. The word isn't intelligence, but there's thought to be a connection between enlightenment, seeing the world more clearly, and greater happiness. The premise being that the source of our suffering is that we don't see the world clearly. Now, that per se is not part of your view, right?
Well, I mean, if one looks at suffering in the vast majority of organisms and in the earth, is it through lack of perception or lack of insight? Suffering long predated humans. I see the value of enlightenment or insight is more in the capacity that rationalism gives us to actually understand the biological genetic basis of suffering. Okay. Essentially, that suffering, discontent, malaise is fitness enhancing. And if you look at each of our core emotions and the forms of, in many cases, nastiness that they mediate, each, in a sense, has played a particular role in the ancestral environment of adaptation. Mm-hmm. And we've got to now take a decision whether we want to preserve these emotions, that both their role and the raw feels, or whether we want to phase them out. The trouble with the term enlightenment is, yes, I mean, your enlightenment might be different from mine, and that, of course, might be different from someone else's, whereas the advantage of focusing on recalibrating the hedonic treadmill, it's a bit of a mouthful, but information-sensitive gradients of bliss or well-being, is that you're not asking people to give up their existing values and preferences, unless, that is, they are committed to retaining their existing hedonic set points. Right. Because, just humans in particular, with our countless, we're social primates, countless conflicting values and preferences, they're for the most part, they're irreconcilable. Whereas what one can, sometimes I give, this is rather sort of trite example or something, like only one team can win at football, only one person can be world chess champion, and so on. You just cannot reconcile these conflicting preferences. Whereas the kind of the molecular substrates of bliss or well-being don't need to be rationed. Hedonic set points, they don't need to be conserved at their existing level. If I sometimes give this, it's a very schematic example of, if today's hedonic range is -10 to hedonic 0 to +10, with, if they're lucky, most people being perhaps 1 or 2 or 3 plus, there is no technical reason why we can't ratchet up hedonic range and ratchet up hedonic set points to a much higher level. Now, this is not enlightenment. This isn't telling anyone that they've got to change their existing values or preferences, but it is radically increasing, potentially generate everyone's default quality of life.
Okay. Now, of course, by hedonic you mean basically the subjective experience of well-being. I mean, happiness, pleasure, whatever, right? And the hedonic treadmill that you refer to is, this fact that the way life is ordinarily lived, it seems like we have to keep doing more to retrieve an ever elusive kind of happiness, right? I mean, it's like, You think, oh, this donut's going to make me feel good. The pleasure fades. You want more. This promotion's going to make me feel good. The pleasure fades. You want another promotion. The hedonic treadmill is this fact of seeming to have to keep working to get this gratification that keeps evaporating. And that's why you have to keep working. Now, I wonder whether that isn't, is it clear that that's not a very fundamental problem? Is it clear that it's in principle possible to get off the hedonic treadmill? I think, Buddhism has an affirmative answer, but I don't think you'd take their word for it. And I think we should maybe, before you answer that, distinguish between kind of two problems. I mean, you referred to the fact that, you earlier alluded to human nastiness, and that is one problem. And you also separately alluded to the fact that we often are in zero-sum competitions. Only one person can have this prize. Only one person can have this mate. And that, of course, elicits a certain amount of nastiness, or can. You can be nasty toward your mate, for your rival for a mate, for example. It seems to me that problem is in principle soluble. You can arrange for people to be in more non-zero-sum relationships and fewer zero-sum relationships. That's at least possible, and that would presumably bring out more in the way of friendliness and less in the way of pointless competition for kind of gradients of happiness, gratification. But the hedonic treadmill is a separate problem. In other words, even if you imagine a totally asocial species, imagine we were designed to never even encounter our fellow beings, it still seems that for whatever reason, natural selection settled on this motivational mechanism of making gratification evaporate. Now,
yes, indeed.
Now, it's not obvious to me that was some kind of gratuitous decision, quote, on natural selection's part. Of course, it's not a conscious being, so I'm being metaphorical when I talk about natural selection's decisions, but it seems to be an open question whether natural selection could have proceeded in a way that didn't involve the eternal evaporation of gratification, or whether, in fact, there's something almost metaphysical at work. Not in the exotic, New Agey sense of metaphysics, but in the philosopher's sense of metaphysics. In other words, it just has to do with the nature, the connection of subjective experience to motivation, right? I mean, if you are blissful, you just sit around and don't do stuff, and natural selection wanted us to do stuff. And even if we choose not to do the things natural selection wants us to do, we still have to get fed. We still have to do some things to survive. So is it possible, in principle, to get off the hedonic treadmill and still go around doing stuff,
Yes, I think what is terrible is not the hedonic treadmill per se, but the fact that our hedonic set points, for the most part, are so low. If, for example, our hedonic range were plus 70 to a plus 100, with, let's say, a hedonic set point at around plus 85, even though the hedonic treadmill would still operate, even, the worst bad hair day in post-human paradise would be far richer, indeed more sublime than anything we're physiologically capable of today. Now, that's all a bit speculative and sci-fi, but one merely needs to look at today's hedonic outliers, people who aren't clinically manic, but are what psychologists call hyperthymic. They have very high hedonic set points. The
set point being just kind of your average level of happiness, the thing to which you kind of tend to return after some striving or after some setbacks or whatever.
Indeed. Now, unfortunately, there are some people who spend almost their whole life below hedonic zero. Some days are better or worse than others, but nonetheless they are generically unhappy. But equally, towards the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are essentially always happy, but nonetheless they are still sensitive to punishment and reward. They still preserve critical insight, sense of social responsibility. And evolution seems to have just played with the hedonic dials. On the whole, low mood tends to be associated with behavioral suppression, good mood, going out, doing things, sensitivity to reward. In one sense, it is more of a high-risk strategy, being temperamentally extremely happy. More good things than bad things can happen. But essentially, evolution doesn't care.
Doesn't care what the set point is, you mean?
Yeah, well, in the sense of the well-being of individual organisms.
Yeah, right. Natural selection doesn't care about our happiness. No, it just cares about, by definition, one thing, that getting genes into the next generation, and so we are stuck with the tendencies that helped our ancestors get genes into the next generation. Not necessarily eternally stuck, but some of them are pretty firmly built in. So one question though is, first of all, do we really know that people's set points are so dramatically different? After all, we don't have direct access to how happy they are. We rely on their reports. And I know in my own case, people say, well, how you doing? And I'm like, oh, I guess I'll survive another day. But when I think about it, I'm not unhappy. That's almost just a way of talking. It's just almost the way, the kind of attitude I was brought up with, in a way. Now, I don't doubt that there must be differences. There must be, but it is a little bit of a methodological problem we face, right, that we have to overcome before we can really confidently conclude that these people who say, oh, I'm having another glorious day, really feel any better than I feel. I'm not. I actually feel pretty sure that some of them don't. For all I know, none of them do. But now this is an obscure problem, but you've probably thought about this. You're very philosophically inclined, right? So,
and there are a number of worries here. First, there is the kind of the general skeptical worries about the problem of other minds. But putting radical skepticism to one side, yes, how can we trust people's self-reports? And sadly, something like suicide or suicide attempts and self-mutilation, this must count as a pretty honest signal. And even before the genetic revolution, we knew from twin studies and differences between fraternal and identical twins that something like depression, low mood had a high genetic loading. And it's only now that we're starting to tease out some of the particular genes, variant alleles, and allelic combinations associated with low and good mood. Intuitively, it's exceptionally complicated. But before going on to, let's say, low mood, take something like pain that blights innumerable lives and, of course, is responsible for a lot of depression too. A single gene appears to act as a volume switch for most higher organisms. The SCN9A gene, for instance, nonsense mutations confer a complete inability to experience any form of pain, but other mutations confer extremely high or low pain thresholds. And other things being equal, I think what we should be aiming for is ensuring that using pre-implantation genetic screening to ensure that all future children have extremely high pain thresholds. Now, this isn't abolishing pain, capacity to feel pinprick-like pain altogether, but it is ratcheting things up in a desirable direction. Now, in the case of hedonic set points, there is no single master gene there, but something like the COMT gene, or catechol-O-methyltransferase, two variants. One is associated with a pretty high, the other a pretty low hedonic set point. Other things being equal, which would one prefer one's offspring to have, or should one just trust Mother Nature or Providence or God? And okay, there are a lot of complications here. I'm sure some of them are already springing to mind. But if we are ethically serious about getting rid of involuntary suffering in humans and ultimately throughout the rest of the living world, we are going to have to tackle its genetic biological roots. This isn't a simplistic genetic determinism.
Now, people could do that one thing now, right? They could test if they're if their children are like fertilized in vitro or I mean maybe there are other ways of there might be other ways of you could I guess do a test in utero and selectively abort. There are various ways that parents could, if they wanted to, now be selecting a higher pain threshold for their children. I mean, the technology is there.
Oh, indeed, it's not done at the moment. At least in the West, pre-implantation genetic screening is only done if, let's say, you know that your child is seriously at risk of having a disease like cystic fibrosis,
right,
or something like that.
I know that's being done, but I mean it's interesting. I mean, the ethical line seems to be that if you can define the thing as a pathology that you're getting rid of, it's considered much more acceptable to get rid of it by those. Of course, some people consider it not acceptable under any circumstances. But if what you're doing is just kind of life enhancing, and of course this is a strictly almost arbitrary, linguistic designation. In truth, I mean, what is it? I mean, feeling a lot of pain, you could call a pathology, right? And so you could say raising the pain threshold is not merely life enhancing; it's pathology eliminating. But this is, in fact, the ethical line that tends to be taken for granted, right?
Yes, this, as you rightly point out, this distinction between remediation and enhancement, it's essentially arbitrary, and that by the standards of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, let alone our transhuman and post-human descendants, all of today's so-called enhancements are remediation. Just our quality of life, essentially as aging, malaise-ridden, cognitively infirm humans. I mean, calling what we're doing enhancement is laughable in one sense.
So in that sense, a kind of dark view of the human condition helps you in a way rhetorically, because you can say we are mired in pathologies and everything you want to do involves getting rid of them. But do you see? Well, you're looking puzzled, so never mind. I retract what I said.
No. I mean, it's true. I have, in one sense, you could say this is very one-sided. I haven't talked about the joys of life, right, the beauty of nature, the pleasure one gets over child's, the good side of life. But nonetheless, I think of Darwinian life is essentially, extremely nasty. Something like, a million people take their own lives each year. Just the tip of an iceberg of misery. Hundreds of millions are depressed. Life doesn't have to be like that. And though there are countless palliatives one could offer, if one is really going to phase out suffering altogether, one has got to tackle its genetic roots.
Now, quick policy question. One way it seems to me this will naturally unfold is that when parents, especially maybe parents who have a history in their family of people with really low pain thresholds, suffering a lot, they may choose to do what you're describing and ensure that their offspring has a higher pain threshold. The way that would work out in the American system is that basically affluent families could afford that because it'll be very expensive at first, and poor families won't. So you'll see increasingly a kind of genetic stratification. Do you, now you being, I assume, British, I might imagine that you would have a different view of the way this will or should play out. Do you have a view on that? I mean, does the government have an obligation to make, whether you want to call them life-enhancing or pathology-avoiding technologies, equally accessible to all? I mean, especially if the change is going to be represented in the genetic line.
Well, it's certainly extraordinarily cost-effective to do this in first world and third world countries alike, to have routine screening, offer all prospective parents pre-implantation genetic screening and counseling. Extremely cost effective. Of course, one one should worry about social inequalities, but, and this is going to sound very optimistic, but yeah, the price, as has been said, this is not original, but the price of any information-based technology trends inexorably to zero, whereas decoding the first human genome cost of $1 billion or more, the price has now come down to a few $100s. Yes, so the cost is coming down inexorably, and just as your music collection and movie collection is as good as Bill Gates, the same is going to be true of genetic code. What is more expensive is expertise in counseling, but nonetheless, developments in artificial intelligence too mean that prospective parents, for example, won't need to become the equivalent of molecular biologists. They'll be able to take professional advice from other sources. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, one reason a person might be pessimistic, notwithstanding everything you've said about, the prospect of enduring pretty stable happiness, is that so many of the hedonic interventions involving drugs turn out to be futile in the sense that what goes up must come down. And this is why addiction ensues. And it would be one thing if addiction led to the eternal bliss, but it famously doesn't, right? Cocaine addicts are not eternally blissful. It just doesn't work that way. Now, I guess with things like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that kind of category of drugs, you seem to see, I guess, less of that, although even those often peter out in effectiveness after a few years. I guess my question is, do we understand really at a biochemical level why so many of these interventions are futile and don't really get around the hedonic treadmill problem, but in a certain sense make it more salient? Do we understand? Is that something that we've kind of mastered, and now we know? Well, this is how a drug just has to be different from cocaine to do the trick, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I could sing you a happy story of what I think will be feasible in the long run, but I think a lot of your listeners obviously focused on more short-term issues. And a lot of today's drugs are a pretty mediocre bunch. And I think this is one reason to focus more on the long-term and the genetic rather than the short-term and pharmacological. In the case of today's therapies, I think one of the big problems is that the particular neurotransmitter system and its receptor subtype most intimately involved in hedonic tone, i.e. the mu opioid receptor, is associated with all manner of other problems. I mean, this is it, that opioids are effective antidepressants, but they have all sorts of side effects, as we know. I mean, not merely the well-known ones such as a physiological tolerance, but they tend to make people quite asocial, as distinct from antisocial. I mean, yes, one could already help many people, in a sense, who are severely depressed and don't respond to existing therapies by giving them indefinite access to opioids under controlled conditions. But this is not the route forward for the bulk of humanity. And one of the characteristics of something like opioids is that they deliver indiscriminate well-being, not critical discernment. And
right.
And perhaps the hardest challenge is not delivering to anyone just raw happiness. It's to do so in a way that preserves social responsibility and critical insight. And that is one thing. Yeah.
But is it clear that it is really in principle possible to deliver the happiness with the controlled dosage? In other words, is it not the case that if you say to me, take 2 Vicodin or whatever every 6 hours, and I do that, even if I control myself and don't overdo it and do exactly what the doctor ordered, isn't there some increasingly, as that 4 hours or whatever I said, 6 hours, as it proceeds, isn't there increasingly a kind of a restlessness and a hunger for more on my part?
I choose my words carefully here, because what I don't want to do is come across as an advocate of opioids. I think they have horrendous problems. But in the case of people who suffer from refractory depression that does not respond to any of the existing therapies, I think they should be given the option. Yes, tolerance sets in and one has to keep on increasing the dose. But nonetheless, in the case of, let's say, rodents given unlimited access to food, water, and opioids, they can lead normal lifespans, whereas captive rodents given unlimited access to cocaine will be dead within a month.
Mm-hmm.
And something like an agent like tianeptine, which is a licensed antidepressant, at least in parts of the world. There was a study in Nature, a bombshell study in Nature in 2014. Tianeptine is a full mu and delta opioid agonist, and for unexplained reasons, it's also an antidepressant that doesn't seem to show quite the degree of tolerance that one associates with existing opioids. Now, I mean, here we're getting into quite nitty-gritty issues.
Yeah, we don't have to. It's just a kind of in principle question. So let me ask you, though, one term you use a lot, and I don't understand the meaning totally, is information-sensitive gradients of bliss. Is that your term?
Yes. Although it's a bit of a mouthful, I think it's worth preserving, because I think some people are worried that, as I said, I think I would not want anyone to suffer on my account, but nonetheless, if I were to undergo misfortune, I would want it to diminish the well-being of friends and family, and the informational sensitivity is worth stressing. So, because without it, relationships don't really mean anything. Yeah.
So you mean, does this address the concern that blissful people are basically impervious to motivational information? In other words,
it's essentially yes. If someone has mainlined heroin, they are going to be blissful regardless of what is happening to their family or friends or misfortune in the world. Whereas someone who is temperamentally extremely optimistic with a high hedonic set point can still be extremely motivated to go out to make the world a better place. In a sense, nothing need be lost by having a high hedonic set point, and much could be gained. Whereas just indiscriminate well-being, like indiscriminate depression, is a recipe for idiocy and amoral behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we? So you are you're long-run optimistic about the prospects for human happiness, and you think actually manipulating genes, either selectively preserving genes or presumably even engineering new ones, is the main ticket, more than pharmacological interventions. Why don't we talk a little about the thing I alluded to, your interest in reducing animal suffering, and as a segue to that, let's just pause on this point that you've never tasted meat, which I take it is, in a sense, an accident of birth. I mean, not only your parents, but your grandparents were vegetarians. But, aren't you curious about what meat tastes like? What is it that keeps you from sampling it? Is it a sense that of how wrong it would be, or are you not curious?
Well, if I pass a butcher's or the meat counter in a supermarket, I respond in the same way as you would pictures of the Holocaust. Essentially, non-human animals like pigs are as sentient and sapient as human toddlers. And the way that humans treat non-human animals will get the perpetrators locked up for life if the victims were human. Now we're habituated to it, but at least most people are. But nonetheless, it's absolutely frightful what we're doing. Yeah,
that's interesting.
So no, I don't have any.
Because I accept the proposition abstractly that it's wrong to kill, to make animals suffer. But when I smell bacon, I'm tempted, and so the question arises. And of course, I wasn't brought up. I was brought up eating bacon. I mean, that's the short version of the answer. But I guess a question is, in your own case, do you think it was the pairing of the ethical instruction with your like sometimes smelling meat? In other words, your parents had just told you like this is bad. Do you think that's the reason that you have immediately just intuitively negative connotations associated with the smelling of bacon, whereas I have the connotation of bacon, you know?
Yes, I'm sure this does come into it. What exactly am I missing? The choice between a veggie burger and a hamburger. I accept that most people prefer the taste of a hamburger to the taste and texture of a veggie burger. But is it really so wonderful and sublime as to somehow justify or outweigh the horrific suffering that goes into it? I'm not convinced.
No, it is. But again, it isn't as an abstract proposition that I'm arguing with you. I'm just telling you the way it, I'm just saying it's possible to believe what you believe and still, when you smell bacon, not have your thoughts immediately turn to the suffering of a pig, but rather the suffering
absolutely.
that I am myself enduring by virtue of not eating the bacon. Okay.
Yeah, I completely. I mean, when I said I only became vegan perhaps 15 years ago. And if I see cheese or eggs, I'm not instantly thinking of the condition of factory farm.
So your parents were vegetarian but not vegan.
Vegan. Just as, if I'm shopping in the supermarket, I'm not visualizing the conditions in which factory workers manufacturing my iPhone were putting it together or anything like that. It's not, as I say, that this is just a pure accident of birth, but nonetheless it means that there isn't this degree of confounding of self-serving bias. In other areas of life, yes, I'm as capable of self-serving bias as anyone. But I think 50 years from now, when the in vitro meat revolution will hopefully have come to pass, and factory farms and slaughterhouses will have been shut down and outlawed, and our grandchildren will be incredulous that we can have behaved towards sentient beings in the way we do.
No, I suspect that's true. I mean, when you ask the question of like what values are commonly held today that at some point in the future, kind of like slavery today, like people can't imagine there were ever slaves, that it was ever formally validated in law and everything. But if you ask, well, what is the comparable thing that now we subscribe to, or many people do, that future generations won't believe we subscribe to? I agree, I think, that the way we treat animals is probably the clearest candidate. Of course, it'll be easier when, as you say, there are things that taste identical to meat, that like literally identical, whether because they are grown in a test tube, as you suggest, or for whatever other reason. But I think you're probably right about that. So now, are you active on this front? I mean, do you do animal rights crusading, or is it more like thinking about how, in the long run, how do we need to arrange technological, pursuit and even research and so on, so that in the long run we just completely eliminate the problem of the suffering of non-human animals?
I think, I mean, one of the other definitions one can offer of transhumanism is technical solutions to ethical problems. And sure, yes, over the years, many discussions and debates over the ethics of meat eating and animal abuse. But whereas one can engage in discussion, a minority of people are prepared to debate. Most people just shrug their shoulders and say the equivalent, but I like the taste. And one can't argue with moral apathy like that. And so the only long-term solution, as I see it, is to develop and commercialize in vitro meat of a taste and texture that is indistinguishable from existing meat products. And most people, they may be callous, but they're not malicious. And other things being equal, if there is cruelty-free and traditionally produced meat, I'm pretty confident that most people will go for the cruelty-free in vitro option. I think it's going to be critical to stress that in vitro meat is not genetically engineered. It could be to enhance its nutritional properties, but I think it's much safer to stress the natural versus the unnatural products of factory farming. I think not all vegans and animal rights activists would agree, but we shouldn't overestimate our powers of moral persuasion. But I think once in vitro meat actually does hit the supermarket shelves and it gets enough celebrity endorsements, then the majority of the population will make the transition and probably will be extremely morally indignant towards the refuseniks. Indeed, I suspect, that slaughterhouses will then be shut. There was an extraordinary study, I haven't got chapter and verse, I wish I did to hand, in which people were asked not about the ethics of vegetarianism or veganism or animal rights, but whether they would support closing all slaughterhouses. And a very large minority of people in this study, which needs replicating, said yes, they would favour shutting all slaughterhouses. So in that sense, you could say I'm optimistic that when the in vitro meat revolution does happen, that things will very rapidly accelerate. But until then, yes, frightful suffering. Yeah.
Okay. Now we talked a little about how some of your emphases sound a little Buddhist. The emphasis on eliminating suffering of all sentient beings, certainly. But just to return to the human dimension for a second, in looking at how Buddhists try to increase human well-being. And in some cases, the word bliss enters in. When you look at the Buddhist approach, and maybe we should say almost the Western Buddhist approach, because in Asia, Buddhism is much more of a full-fledged religion with prayers and so on. But just the approach of kind of meditation, informed by Buddhist philosophy, and by Buddhist ethics and so on. Do you look at that and just think of it as kind of hopelessly old? Well, do you think of it as kind of just old-fashioned? In other words, we can do better using modern technology, or do you view it as misguided in other ways as well? Are there some of its kind of philosophical emphases you disagree with, or what? I mean, just kind of quickly, what is your basic view of Buddhism?
I mean, everything one knows about the historical Buddha suggests that, above all, he was a pragmatist. He was interested in what works. And though if I start talking about Buddhism now, I can be pretty confident that someone will say, hey, you haven't understood the true meaning of Buddhism, and perhaps not. Nonetheless, I kind of Gautama Buddha, if he were to appear now, I think we could be pretty confident he wouldn't say, you haven't understood the Noble Eightfold Path. He would be absolutely overjoyed to see developments in biotechnology, insofar as they are going to be, in the long run, capable of phasing out suffering. Meditation, I suppose over the years I've known some people, this is quite personal, I've known some people who have found meditation absolutely fantastic and swear by it. Others, mixed results. A minority of people, it hasn't helped. Indeed, it can make melancholic depression, people prone to ruminate, worse. So in that sense, yes, I'm sympathetic to meditation. I think everyone should, not everyone, but so long as you don't have ruminative, melancholic depression, that people should try something like Buddhist meditational techniques. But no, I don't see them as a panacea. No, that's true.
Okay. So final question, is, to what extent, if any, does transhumanist function for its most kind of intense advocates as a kind of religion? I mean, you hear this about the singularity, right? Like the people who are really wrapped up in the singularity idea, they treat it as the second coming and so on. It functions for them the way end times discussions function maybe for Christians or something. I know you're not wrapped up in singularity apparently in the way that some of these people are. So maybe the question has two aspects. One is, for some transhumanists, is this really in some ways quite like a religion, functionally speaking, in terms of what it does for them and their motivational structure and their sense of reassurance and so on? And then secondly, does it have any of those properties for you? Does transhumanism do for you any of the things that religions do for people?
Personally, no. As I said, successful prophets tend to locate salvation or doom within the lifetime of their prospective audience. And if I believed that we really were on the cusp of a breakthrough to post-human superintelligence within the next 30 or 40 years, possibly I would be getting quite evangelical. But
you'd also be getting higher speaking fees.
Well, sometimes I'm tempted to over-egg the pudding, to use a non-vegan metaphor, and that if people thought that it were really going to be possible to engineer life based on gradients of superhuman bliss within their lifetime, their interest would probably perk up. Whereas if you tell them that this is likely to be several hundred years away, their interest fades. And this is the same true of something like radical life extension. If I tell you, that science is going to find a cure for aging in the next 20 or 30 years, it's extremely exciting. If you tell people that it's going to be 80 or 100 years, i.e. science will find a cure for aging after you're dead, it can be almost cruel. So, once again, transhumanists are an incredibly diverse bunch, and so if I start generalizing, there will be lots of exceptions. But on the whole, transhumanists are secular rationalists. I mean, there are some religious transhumanists, but even the transhumanists are religious. It's not religion in the traditional
Although
sense.
my question is, in a way, can a secular rationalist have the functional equivalent of a religion in transhumanism? Not that they get supernatural about it or anything, but just that it does for them psychologically what religion does for people. But
in the sense of meaning, the sense of meaning and purpose that it offers, I suppose, yes.
But you would say it doesn't like dull their critical faculties or anything. They don't get so wrapped up in this singularity business that they really greatly overestimate the chances of it happening in the proximity.
Some transhumanists would assign a much higher credence to some kind of intelligence explosion happening in our lifetime than I personally would. But I just have not encountered zealotry, fanaticism, blind faith, refusal to listen to rational arguments. No, not personally. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the time, David. Where can people go if they want to sign up for your cause or do anything else you'd like them to do? Is there a website, a Twitter feed? Now we should mention there is an online manifesto written by you called the Hedonist Imperative, right?
The Hedonistic Imperative. Yes, this was a manifesto written back in 1995 when the web was young, in spite of its debauched overtones, as a morally serious message.
But you mean the debauched overtones of the web or of your own manifesto?
It's in a sense, it was because it was written before the human genome was sequenced. Inevitably, parts of it are dated, but not the core ethic. This was hedweb.com, hedweb.com. Hedweb.com was my motherlode website where I, over 20 years ago now, wrote the Hedonistic Imperative, calling for the use of biotech to phase out suffering throughout the living world. And though, yes, the science is rapidly advancing, I think the core ethic, which derives as much from Buddhism as secular rationalism, is as relevant today as it was then.
Okay, anything else? I mean, Humanity Plus, they can Google. It's just Humanity with a plus sign. That's the descendant of the organization you co-founded.
Yes, indeed. Sign up for Humanity Plus. But yeah, as I said, transhumanism isn't a case. Perhaps it would be stronger as a movement if it did have religious elements and badges and insignia and the rest of it. I'm going next month to Beijing for an H+ conference. I mean, the Chinese are very hot on transhumanist technologies, and they don't have some of the hang-ups we have in the West about eugenics. So China is very interesting.
Well, that's a whole nother story. And the question of to what extent the genetic manipulations will be left up to individuals, and to what extent, in your view, they'd be government, A, subsidized, B, mandated. I mean, that's a conversation for a whole nother day, and maybe we'll have that in the future. But things could get pretty complicated, and I'm not surprised to hear that in China there's less resistance, certainly on the part of the government. So nothing else, no Twitter feed, no Facebook page or anything. People can Google you.
No, as I said, I'm basically a writer and a wordsmith, actually building a successful organization or movement calls for a very different set of skills. And essentially, I write and I think, but yes, I can't ask people to sign up for some mass movement.
Salvation is not at hand. It's in the future.
This, the cliche, winning hearts and minds, I think is really critical, because yes, there are formidable technical challenges to getting rid of suffering, but the biggest obstacle of all is not even ethical, ideological. It's status quo bias. I think that if we encountered an advanced civilization that had got rid of suffering, disease, aging, feeble-mindedness, the idea of reintroducing it would seem crazy. But that's, the entire biosphere is going to be programmable later this century and beyond. I mean, what kind of world do we want to live in? Ultimately, it's going to come down to values. And if I had my way, which isn't going to happen, we would see something like, sponsored by the World Health Organization, a kind of 100-year project to eradicate suffering. All the kind of CRISPR genome editing, pre-implantation screening, in vitro meat even, and spreading benign copies of genes via CRISPR-based gene drives to the rest of the biosphere, the lot. In practice, it's not going to happen that way. That's not sociologically realistic.
I don't know. I'm discouraged by your pessimism. We need to get your set point higher as a prerequisite for inspiring the masses, I think. So,
well, you have we've talked more about me than your work, but I very much enjoyed. When was The Moral Animal written?
1994, a year before your own manifesto.
Yes, in the sense that yes, it is true. I incline to pessimism, but yeah, if you could. Open up the debate, shall we say? And with sort of Buddhists, for example, one doesn't need to persuade Buddhists that the problem of suffering is central. And there are plenty of people in the world today, and in one sense this is good, but in another it's bad, that don't see the problem of suffering as central.
Okay, well, maybe we'll try to get them to worry about it more. But thank you so much. Fascinating conversation, and maybe this, when this gets out there, it will help your cause a little.
Thank you. It's been great chatting.
Okay. Take care.